Okay, welcome to this week's Washington History Seminar, co-sponsored, as always, by the American Historical Association's National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy Program, and on behalf also of my co-chair, Roger Lewis, we're delighted to see all of you for this week's session on Rogue States and the United States, an historical perspective with Dr. Robert Litwack. Let me introduce my colleague Rob in just a moment, but up front say a word of thanks to Marian Barber and Alison Lilakoff on my staff and the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, which generously helps to sponsor this weekly seminar on historical perspectives on international and national affairs. Next week, at the same time, in the same place, we have Rashid Khalidi from Columbia University on Arab nationalism. And this week, we have a special treat for you, a rare appearance by the Center's Vice President for Programs and
Director. I haven't been living at an undisclosed location.
The Director of International Security Studies, Rob Litwack. He, aside from his responsibilities here at the Center, he also teaches at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and he's a consultant with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. During the first Clinton administration, he served on the National Security Council as staff director, as director for non-proliferation. He is the author of several books, including Nuclear Proliferation After the Cold War, Détente and the Nixon Doctrine, American Foreign Policy and the Pursuit of Stability, 1969 to 1976. I was just in Hamburg at a conference a few weeks ago, and one of the papers had at least 25 references to your Détente book. Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Containment After the Cold War, pertinent to, of course, today's talk, and most recently, Regime Change, U.S. Strategy Through the Prism of 9/11. Rob has held a number of distinguished fellowships at Harvard University, at Oxford University, at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and received his doctorate from the London School of Economics. And it's a wonderful treat to introduce to you and welcome my colleague, friend, Rob Litwack. And with that, over to Roger.
Just also a word of welcome, Ron. Ron Steele and I were just having a conversation about the way in which the reputations of individuals and institutions wax over time. And since Christian mentioned that Rob bears the pedigree of the London School of Economics, it is remarkable that this particular institution used to have the reputation as being the center of the intellectual universe. Now, whether or not this
I wrote my own doctoral dissertation.
We do have a ritual of letting everyone just pronounce who they are and what they're up to. We'll begin with Ron Steele.
Ron Steele, I'm a former Wilson Fellow, and I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Donnelly, and I work in the Woodrow Wilson Center Mexico Institute.
Arnita Jones, Director Emerita from the American Historical Association.
Pat Harahan, former Wilson Scholar, retired.
I'm Marianne Birtler from Germany. I'm a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center.
David Kyvig, former Wilson Fellow and Emeritus from Northern Illinois University.
Zed David, Senior Scholar here at the Wilson Center in Eastern European area.
I'm Marley Clymer, wife of a scholar, and retired and enjoying these very much.
I'm Kenton Clymer, Northern Illinois University History Department, and I'm here as a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Institute.
Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center, and I'm originally from Northern Illinois, not the university, just the region.
Good afternoon. My name is Claire Chaeyoung Lee, and I'm from South Korea. I'm a junior scholar working under North Korea International Documentation Project.
Hi, Ya-Feng Xia, Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. But I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center.
Sam Wells, I'm a senior scholar here working on the strategic buildup coming out of the Korean War.
I'm Will Pomerantz. I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
I'm Chuck Krause, and I'm a research assistant in the North Korea International Documentation Project.
I'm James Wilson with the Office of the Historian at the State Department.
I'm Ryan Jacobs. I'm with the Department of State's Office of the Historian.
I'm Lane Schur. I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center's Development Office.
I'm Elizabeth Byers, and I work with the Wilson Center on the Hill program and the program on America and the Global Economy here at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Hi, I'm Rachel Kazara, and I'm working in the Development Office here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Joe Brinley. I'm Director of Woodrow Wilson Center Press.
I'm Marion Barber from the National History Center.
I'm Peter Bierstaker. I'm a staff member with the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Yelena Sitnikova. I'm Fulbright Scholar from in Kennan Institute.
Stephanie Wilson. I'm a colonel in the U.S. Air Force here on a one-year scholarship here at the Wilson Center.
Ria Che, Junior Scholar at Wilson Center.
James Person. I work with Christian Osterman, spearheading the North Korea International Documentation Project here at the center.
Madeline Valtero. I'm a scholar intern at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
James Sang, IBM Research Emeritus.
Hi, I'm Allison Lilakoff, and I'm with the History and Public Policy program here at the center.
Bob Hathaway. I run the Asia program here.
Sherry Wells. I'm from the History Department at George Washington University.
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the center.
I'm Tindrin Wu. I'm a scholar intern at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Great, thanks. With that, over to Rob.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much, Roger. This is a welcome opportunity to address a group largely composed of historians to discuss my current research project. And though the focus is contemporary and intended for a policy audience, I use history as a tool of policy analysis. In the 1990s, when I was working on the National Security Council staff, as Christian mentioned, the term rogue state entered the U.S. foreign policy lexicon. This term was used by the President of the United States to designate a distinct category of states in the international system. The rogue states were hostile countries pursuing weapons of mass destruction and were state sponsors of terrorism. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was the archetype. In addition to Iraq, the core group of rogue states was Iran, North Korea, and Libya. Senator Moynihan, the founder of the Woodrow Wilson Center, once said, "How you think about the world affects how you act in the world." That's a paraphrase. That always struck me as a good description of the mission of this institution. So when I returned to the center from the NSC, I began research on the topic of rogue states, kind of a fundamental threshold question, an assumption upon which policy was being based. Where did the term come from? How was it translated into policy? That research culminated in the book Rogue States in U.S. Foreign Policy, published in 2000, which presented a strong critique of the concept and the policy. It was a unilateral American political concept with no standing in international law. It lumped and demonized a diverse group of states, and in so doing, obscured our understanding of them. And it distorted policy by promoting a one-size-fits-all approach to this group. The subtitle of the book was Containment After the Cold War, and called for the adoption of a differentiated set of strategies, each strategy tailored to the particular circumstances in each country. 9/11 led to the redefinition of threat and strategy. President Bush shifted from containment to a strategy emphasizing regime change. The focus was on the character of the regimes. The argument went that the dangerous behavior, the objectionable conduct, derived from the very character of these regimes. So therefore, we needed to change the regimes to change the behavior. And that argumentation directly fed into the preventive war against Iraq in 2003. But in the aftermath of Iraq, the Bush administration was not able to replicate that model in dealing with other hard cases, Iran and North Korea. It sent a mixed message whether the U.S. strategy, the objective toward Iran and North Korea, was to change their regimes or to change their objectionable conduct. And in the end, it got neither. And that chronology, sequence of events, led to a second book, Regime Change, the core argument of which was that the mixed message coming from Washington about the objective of U.S. strategy was frustrating Washington's ability to test North Korea's and Iran's nuclear intentions. And the recommendation of the book was to clarify the U.S. objective, to make clear, as one policy official put it, that the United States was willing to take yes for an answer. If they changed their conduct, we would normalize relations with them. The Obama administration came to office with a declared willingness to diplomatically engage adversaries. That was a controversial stance during the 2008 election. President Obama kind of recast the rogue state debate, emphasizing not the unilateral American political concept of rogue state, but rather a focus on conduct that violated international norms in order to build multilateral support for U.S. policy. President Obama eschewed the rogue state rubric, referring to Iran and North Korea as outlier states. That change in nomenclature was a deliberate choice, an act to signal to these regimes that they were not beyond the pale, not irredeemable, that the United States would be willing to take yes for an answer in order to test their intentions. President Obama declared that a change in the behavior of the outliers would permit them to take, as he put it, quote, their rightful place in the community of nations, close quote. That policy shift from President Bush to President Obama has led to my third in an unintended series of books on this topic, the working title of which is Outlaws and Outliers, U.S. Foreign Policy from Regime Change to Engagement, which reflects not only the shift from Bush to Obama, but also the range of possible strategies. Now let me begin by putting the rogue state issue in historical and conceptual context. In its national security strategy of 2010, the Obama administration declared that, quote, those nations that defy international norms will be denied the incentives that come with greater integration and collaboration with the international community, close quote. Richard Haas once referred to integration as the grand strategy of the United States, and there's a long historical lineage. Integration or isolation, that was the stark choice presented by the Obama administration to regimes that egregiously violated international norms. The administration promoted a, quote, rules-based international system, close quote. But that objective raises a thorny issue. Who sets the rules? How are they interpreted? How are they enforced? More fundamentally, what is the character of the international order from which outlaw and outlier states stand apart? Is it appropriate to refer to the international system as an international society, as the English would say, inverted commas? International relations theorist Hedley Bull argued that international society exists when states, quote, conscious of certain common interests and common values, conceive themselves to be bound by a common set of rules in their relations with each other. and share in the working of common institutions, close quote. This definition of international society is essentially synonymous with the Obama administration's usage of international community. Critics of diplomatically engaging outliers like Iran and North Korea dismiss the term as gaseous rhetoric. What international community? I'll address the substance of the alternative approach embodied in that criticism, but on the narrow point of rhetorical excess. In historical context, the community metaphor is restrained. American presidents from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln, and from Franklin Roosevelt to Richard Nixon, most recently including George W. Bush, have referred to the international system with the even more utopian-sounding family of nations. Although Bull propounded the concept of international society, he famously characterized the contemporary international system as an anarchical society. Anarchical because there is no supreme national authority governing relations among competing sovereign states, yet a society nonetheless because of the convergence of interests and values among states that has yielded international norms and institutions. The challenges to international order historically have arisen from dissatisfied states that reject its governing norms and the status quo. Typically, these states are revisionist. Their aims are limited, a claim to a disputed territory, for example, and those disputes are pursued within the existing international system. In contrast, revolutionary states have unbound ambition and are seeking the wholesale transformation of the international order itself. The emergence of expansionist great powers with unbound ambition, Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, led to the greatest periods of upheaval and tumult in the 20th century. No major power currently poses a revolutionary threat to the system. In 1989, George Kennan declared an end to the Cold War to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, saying that the Soviet Union had evolved from a revolutionary state into an orthodox great power. That doesn't mean it's a democracy. It just means it's no longer pursuing kind of the revolutionary total objectives that it had at the inception of the Russian Revolution. To be sure, China's maritime moves in the South China Sea and Russia's assertive foreign policy in the Caucasus and elsewhere on its periphery are sources of concern. But those moves are closer to the Monroe Doctrine than to the Comintern. The National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2015, its assessment concluded that the rising powers in the international system, the so-called BRICS, Russia, China, Brazil, India, Brazil, and other rising powers, are, quote, unlikely to challenge the international system, close quote. Instead, the contemporary challenge is posed by a set of relatively marginal actors, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Burma, Zimbabwe, among others, that violate international norms and threaten the stability of their regions. But they lack the capacity, unlike a Nazi Germany, to bring down the system itself. Outlier status derives from violations of widely held international norms in three key areas: proliferation, terrorism, and human rights. The first two behavioral criteria are external, in that their contravention has direct negative consequence for other states in the system, while the third is primarily internal in its impact. Now, in practice, states that contravene norms with external consequences also defy internal behavioral norms. I mean, North Korea has nuclear weapons and it runs a gulag state. Okay, but those states, but at the same time, states that contravene, well, let me just say that to nail the point, those states are the ones that are the focus of my studies, the states that violate external behavioral norms. Of course, there's a far larger group that subjugates their own populations, but they do not pose a threat beyond their borders. Zimbabwe is a human rights pariah, but it doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. It's not a state sponsor of terrorism. Likewise, Burma does not command the attention in Washington that North Korea does. So you can have the externals, the states that violate external behavioral norms also abuse their own people, but not every state that abuses its own people engages in conducts that has external consequences that will raise concern in among other states. The challenge in looking at this set, the ones that violate the external behavioral norms that also violate the internal behavioral norms, is how can we address external behavior of concern to the United States, terrorism, proliferation, while not ignoring the conduct that flouts international norms with respect to how they treat their own people. That's a real bind in policy terms. To the extent one can speak of the international system as a society, it relates to the acceptance, to the extension and acceptance of norms. Now, central to that process has been international law, for example, through treaties. But unlike national legal systems, which citizens must obey, we can't just blow off laws, the 10th Amendment notwithstanding. State participation in international law is entirely voluntary. For example, the Israel, Pakistan, and India chose not to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That was their sovereign right to stand aside from that treaty. Iran and North Korea are a focus of non-proliferation concern because they did sign up to the deal. They signed up to the treaty and then cheated within the treaty. So North Korea and Iran, in policy terms, on a host of reasons, are viewed in a different light than Israel, Pakistan, and India. Give them their due. They never joined up. You know, they exercised their sovereign right. And there's no supranational authority that can compel them to sign up because it's a voluntary, consensual arrangement. The consensual basis of international law underscores the centrality of sovereignty, the cardinal principle of international relations that protects states from interference in their domestic affairs. Political scientist Stephen Krasner has called sovereignty organized hypocrisy. The international environment, he observed, quote, has been characterized by competing and often logically contradictory norms, not some single coherent set of rules, close quote. Nothing is more controversial in this realm than establishing limits on sovereignty, such that in extreme cases it does not provide a shield of non-interference behind which regimes can commit gross violations of human rights against their own populations. These issues were in play at the very founding of the United Nations, and they have lineage, of course, that goes much further back. Who's in the community, basically, was the question at the time of the founding of the United Nations. There was a proposal that the UN should be composed only of democracies. During those negotiations leading to the UN Charter in 1945, delegates debated, and they used the term, whether rogue states should be expelled from the new organization. And in the end, they decided that expulsion of these states would create a lawless zone where, quote, expelled members would be free of their obligations, close quote, and outside the UN's authority. Consistent with that view, the Charter accorded states sovereign equality. However authoritarian or even criminal the character of the ruling regimes, and prescribed the United Nations from, quote, intervening in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state, close quote. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 created a diplomatic instrument to apply moral pressure on repressive regimes, but did not constitute a meaningful limit on state sovereignty. A generation later, the issue returned. Secretary General Kofi Annan convened the United Nations high-level panel, which affirmed, quote, the emerging norm of a collective international responsibility to protect, close quote. But that norm is in competition with the norm of sovereignty. Consider Uganda and Cambodia. When Tanzania intervened in Uganda, when Vietnam intervened when Tanzania intervened in Uganda to overthrow Idi Amin, and Cambodia and Vietnam intervened in Cambodia to overthrow Pol Pot, neither was approved by the United Nations. And indeed, Vietnam was actually condemned by the United Nations. So these competing norms of sovereignty and the responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention, they played out in three recent contingencies. Kosovo, the late 90s, an intervention that was ultimately characterized as legitimate but not legal. Legitimate because it was undertaken by a community of democracies through NATO, but not legal because Russia and China were standing in the way in the United Nations Security Council. Iraq, 1991, 2003. George Bush, the senior, had a far easier time going to the United Nations in 1991 than his son, a little over a decade later. Because Saddam Hussein in 1991 had done the one thing upon which all states can agree. He murdered a state. And so you got unanimity in the Security Council to overturn that aggression, and actually the contention was in the U.S. Congress, which was the reverse of the situation in 2003, where the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, made the controversial argument that the only way in which to bring Saddam Hussein into compliance with UN Security Council resolutions was to negate Iraqi sovereignty, to overturn the regime, to overthrow the regime, inherently controversial. This spring in Libya, the tension was again evident. The UN Security Council resolution talks about responsibility to protect, that type of language. It says nothing about regime change. From the get-go, NATO countries were talking about overturning the Gaddafi regime, which prompted the Arab League a day later to want to opt out of the UN authorized intervention. So these competing norms, sovereignty and humanitarian intervention, which is is essentially an extreme case of domestic abuse, okay? Because states are allowed all kinds of sway to conduct their affairs as they wish within their own states under kind of this principle of sovereignty. That's an example of competing norms. More fundamentally, the process of setting, interpreting, and enforcing international norms, that is, those norms that set the outliers apart, will become increasingly contested given the power shifts occurring in the international system. Back to the National Intelligence Council's 2025 assessment, the one I referred to, that said that the BRIC countries are unlikely to challenge the international order. But the document goes on to argue that, quote, their growing geopolitical and economic clout will provide them a high degree of freedom to customize their political and economic policies rather than fully adopting Western norms, close quote. Now, this clash of norms is exemplified in the dispute between the United States and China over human rights. 2009, the State Department again found that the situation in China remained poor and worsened in some areas. The Chinese government shot back, arguing in its own lengthy report that they had made progress by Western standards, but moreover, they laid out an alternative conception of human rights. The Chinese definition focuses on collective rights, such as raising its people economic standard of living and providing public education, in contrast to the West, whose political tradition focuses on individual rights, such as freedom of speech and the right of assembly. And this exchange between governments highlights the limits to consensus on values within the international community. Now, what of the U.S. role in all of this? Raymond Aron, the French political philosopher, famously characterized the United States as the imperial republic. Imperial, not in sort of Roman Empire, British Empire terms, but rather an imperial state in that it is sort of the lead power in the system to help maintain order. At the same time, it's a republic. That is, a state with its own parochial interests that can act inconsistently, it can act hypocritically. The United States espouses a belief in human rights as a norm, yet it has in the past, for realpolitik reasons, backed authoritarian leaders, some of the worst kind. So it's been inconsistent, but it's there sort of a marker that America keeps coming back to in its political culture. In recent years, some have even called into question whether the United States is a rogue or a revisionist state. John Eikenberry, who's a former fellow here, wrote a very influential book, After Victory, in which he argued that the key to American success after World War II was embedding American power in institutions and norms of the system, which made American power less threatening and more acceptable to other powers. And this is accounted for one of the big kind of realist mystery riddles of the 1990s. If you're a realist and you believe in the balance of power, why didn't the rest of the world balance American power in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was no longer had disintegrated? I think Eikenberry's book argues persuasively that the reason that there wasn't balance in the 1990s was because of this embedded character of American power. Now, after 9/11, the United States diverted from that in two ways. One way was, in terms of counterproliferation policy, in the new era of threat, it launched the preventive war in Iraq on kind of non-proliferation grounds, because the character of the Saddam Hussein regime was such that the United States could not permit that regime to acquire nuclear weapons. But it also, through George W. Bush's freedom agenda, which someone called Wilsonianism on steroids, also engaged in democratization, leading Columbia University professor Robert Jervis to ask whether the United States had become kind of a revisionist power out there kind of promoting through its democracy agenda. And it's an interesting question. If the United States is seeking to promote democracy, human rights, etc., which requires changes within domestic orders, and the international system is based on the principle of sovereignty, which bars interference in domestic affairs, does that make the United States a revisionist power? It's out there sort of as it's more than a talking point. It really does go to the question of America's role in the world, but I think one that Americans should at least take seriously. So the United States' role in promoting kind of the reintegration of the outlier states plays out in a conflicted context, and I've tried to lay out some of that context and some of the kind of policy tensions. What are the pathways to reintegration, of coming in from the cold? Basically, and among historians, I'll talk about agents of change. They're basically two alternative agents of change. There's external change, imposed regime change from without, and internal regime change, that is self-generated regime change from within. Now, with both of these alternative agents of change, the crux issue in principle and in practice is sovereignty. That is, whether compelling a state's compliance with internal behavioral norms is permissible or amounts to domestic interference, and whether externally induced changes of regime can ever be justified. External intervention, even when undertaken on humanitarian grounds, remains inherently controversial because of the sovereignty principle. I alluded to the examples of Tanzania going into Uganda, Vietnam going into Cambodia. It's inherent, recently, Kosovo, Iraq, you name it. External induced regime change will remain inherently controversial in international relations. Internally generated changes of and within regimes are far more common and more legitimate in the eyes of other states. Those internal pathways are dependent on dynamics within a state's leadership and ruling elite. Now, each case is highly context-specific, and the outcome hinges largely on how a regime's core interest groups, whether institutional, familial, ethnic, sectarian, how they gauge their interests, whether their interests favor deeper integration into the international system or continued isolation. Take two cases which I address in one of my book chapters, Romania and South Africa. In Romania, December 1989, you had regime change from within, really the only violent kind of revolution of all of the colored revolutions in Eastern Europe, where you had it was complete with a Romanov-style execution of Ceausescu and his wife. But it was essentially a coup d'etat. In December 1989, the Securitate and the army flipped on Ceausescu and executed him. By contrast, in South Africa, what one had was a kind of years of internal internal contradictions playing out and external pressure, leading to a shift within the Afrikaner community. The regime change occurred when the Afrikaner leaders concluded that apartheid was no longer viable. That was an important fact. It was the critical factor, but it was kind of necessary but not sufficient. You also had the personal role of Mandela, who had extraordinary personal qualities, and those, along with safeguards they provided for the minority community in the new South African Constitution, provided critical reassurance to the South Africa white minority government. I'll return to the question of pathways in my consideration of strategies towards the current outliers, Iran and North Korea. But let me preface that by elaborating a bit on the evolution of the rogue state concept and policy that I introduced in my introduction. An important definitional shift occurred around 1980. Prior to 1980, if you do a literature search, terms outlaw, rogue, and the like relate to internal behavioral criteria. The outlaws of pre-1980 were Idi Amin's Uganda, Pol Pot's Cambodia. After 1980, 79, 80, it shifted to external behavioral criteria, weapons proliferation and terrorism. The United States began its list of state sponsors of terrorism under the Export Administration Act of 1979. And you had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and in the 1980s, a significant increase in proliferation of chemical weapons and ballistic missiles in the third world, what we then called the third world, as well as in Iraq and a nuclear program which the Israelis bombed in 1981. The end of the Cold War coincided with a hot war in the Persian Gulf. And that's where Saddam Hussein, as sort of the archetype rogue state, emerged. As I mentioned, the rogue states were depicted as a distinct category of state in the international system. But there were, to use a big word from the Soviet lexicon, contradictions. It was a unilateral concept. It was applied selectively. It frustrated the American ability to differentiate between different cases, because once you were in the sort of this on the list of the damned, it was very hard to get off the list. And it ran up to hard realities. In 1994, North Korea was on the verge of a nuclear breakout, and it necessitated diplomatic engagement that led to the agreed framework. In 1997, a presumed reformist president was elected in Iran, and the United States wanted to explore the diplomatic possibilities raised by that. The rogue state rubric got in the way of this policy differentiation, and the Clinton administration jettisoned it in favor of the term, the infelicitous phrase, states of concern, which is a phrase a psychiatrist friend of mine tells me we're all in perpetually. The Bush administration pointedly revived the term rogue state and did it as part of its ABC, anything but Clinton approach. But that went into hyperdrive after 9/11, as I mentioned, with the redefinition of threat and the redefinition of strategy. The redefinition of threat was that threat was linked to character of regimes. It derived from their very essence, and the only way to end objectionable, dangerous behavior was to change regimes. That fed into the strategy, recall the Bush Doctrine, preemption, and that the United States would act not only preemptively against imminent threats, and imminence is linked to preemption, but also preventively against emerging threats, much more controversial in international law, but that is what led into the case for a preventive war in Iraq. In 2003, two non-proliferation precedents were set. In Iraq, you had non-proliferation, coercive non-proliferation through regime change. In the aftermath, in the spring of 2003, those heady days before the Iraqi insurgency, a Bush administration official referred to Iraq as, quote unquote, a type. And a certain named State Department official, John Bolton, said that the lesson of Iraq for Iran was take a number. 8 months later, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad, there was another A second non-proliferation precedent was set when that Sunday morning we were all surprised with the announcement from London, Tripoli, and Washington that Gaddafi had agreed to verifiable WMD disarmament. This was the alternative case to Iraq. Now, the Bush administration immediately claimed Libya as a dividend of the Iraq War, that Gaddafi had been scared straight. But I think, in looking at through this case, it was probably necessary but not sufficient. I mean, Iraq certainly got Gaddafi's attention. But what sealed the deal was a tacit but clear assurance of regime security. That is, if Gaddafi gave up his weapons, that the United States would not take out his regime as it had done months earlier in Iraq against Saddam Hussein. And without that, logically, although when you're dealing with the brain, the brain chemistry of Muammar Gaddafi, it's hard to say, but he would not have had an incentive to do the deal in the absence of that security assurance. Now, in the aftermath of Iraq and Libya, the Bush administration was caught between precedents. It couldn't replicate Iraq, and it wasn't willing to offer the full Libya deal with the assurance of security. Dick Cheney said, and it's been back in the press, we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat evil. You had the Bolton statement, Bolton then later saying, I don't do carrots, etc. You had the mixed message, whether the U.S. objective was to change the regime or to change the conduct. That's where the Bush administration was not able to resolve that core contradiction. The president, kind of Richard Neustadt, President Trump, he could have resolved that contradiction with a clearer statement. But I think the history, and David Sanger of the New York Times, who wrote about the Bush administration, is doing another volume. I think when you look back in that period, you'll say that the second Bush administration was really kind of a hostage to the legacy of the first Bush administration. I couldn't get past it. Obama administration came in, and the word that was used was reset in describing relations with Russia. And I think you could say the same in its relations in dealing with Iran and North Korea. The strategy was described as comprehensive engagement. Secretary Clinton described it, though, as a two-track approach: pressure and engagement. And as one official has said, North Korea and Iran don't respond to pressure, but without pressure, they don't respond. So you needed to have pressure in tandem with a willingness to engage, a willingness to take yes for an answer. In Iran, the targeted sanctions have been focused on the Revolutionary Guards, which is the organization linked to the nuclear program, very involved in black market dealings. In North Korea, the targeted sanctions were focused on illicit activities related to the Kim Jong-il regime. They, of course, have China as a patron, and there's been difficulty, as in all sanctions, in getting broad kind of compliance with sanctions. Iran's used dummy corporations in Dubai to circumvent them. The aim in all of this is to affect the core interest groups of these regimes and to change their calculus of decision. The bottom line questions about the Obama administration strategy toward the outliers are, will their leaderships make the choice? That's a word the Obama administration all the time. Will they make the choice to come into compliance with international norms? Will they take the pathway to reintegration into the community of nations? Each case is highly context dependent. It hinges, as I've argued, on the complex and subtle relationship between the target state's foreign and domestic policies. Within Iran, for example, the nuclear issue is a surrogate for a more fundamental foreign policy debate over the Islamic Republic's identity, whether Iran is a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. Hence, President Obama has speculated, quote, it may be that the Iranian regime's ideological commitment to nuclear weapons is such that they're not making a simple cost-benefit analysis on this issue, close quote. In the case of North Korea, the calculus of decision on the nuclear program is linked to regime survival. The nuclear program has utility for a besieged regime, both as a deterrent and as a perennial bargaining chip with which to extract concessions from the United States, Japan, and South Korea. engagement has not produced results. The question for the Bush administration was, would the president take yes for an answer? The question for the Obama administration is, will he take no for an answer? And that no was evident even before the Libya intervention this spring, which was undertaken for humanitarian objectives, provided Iran and North Korea with a talking point, which was, this proves that Gaddafi should never have given up his weapons because the U.S. went for regime change after he disarmed. Now, within this context, there's no good military option either. In North Korea, there's no target. The plutonium was separated and it was moved off-site. With Iran, a military strike would be the most telegraph punch in history. And the Iranians, as we know, now have redundant sites that have air defenses around them. And moreover, as the former head of the IAEA, al-Baradei, says, you can't bomb knowledge. They would reconstitute the system. Do I have a few minutes to develop one last point, Roger, before we do it? Okay. Now, the Iraq War reinforced the widespread but misleading connotation of regime change as representing a sharp split between old and new. It was a dichotomy, basically. Instead, for policy analysis, the term regime change should be viewed as embodying a dynamic process that occurs along a continuum. Total change through war, Germany and Japan, or revolution, China and Iran, is rare. More common, the degree of change is limited, as when there's a change in a political party that leads to a significant policy shift. Probably the most important instance of regime change was accomplished through neither war nor revolution, and that was in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. That was, one could argue, a case of regime change by internal evolution. Now, George Kennan's X article is best known for the containment doctrine. But as this group will know, the title of the article was not Containment, a New Strategy for the United States. It was The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Kennan's genius was that he laid out a concept of societal change for the Soviet Union. It was also a prophecy of how the Cold War could end. Containment was a balance of power strategy to check Soviet power until the inexorable contradictions of that society would lead to an internal change, which did occur. Concepts of societal change are a critical threshold assumption, and they are often unarticulated. They can be more or less a vain hope or ideologically driven. More of that than sound target state analysis. Take an example, 2002. Paul Wolfowitz, then Secretary of Defense, said that North Korea was teetering, and therefore that analysis of what was going on in North Korea fed into his preferred strategy of squeezing North Korea to the point of regime collapse. And given the link between regime character and threat, if you collapse the North Korean regime, the threat would go away. Now, that's a huge threshold assumption. Okay, one could make the contrary case that North Korea is, in a way, a kind of a hyper-stable state. I mean, they're going through stresses that would collapse lots of regimes, and yet they hang in there year after year. Take the debate about Iran now. And I think this goes to the role of the Wilson Center as a place where critical threshold assumptions about policy are identified, elucidated, debated. Basically, the options on Iran boil down to kind of bomb, squeeze, or deal. You have the op-ed pieces advocating bomb now. And if you look at them and sort of kind of at the underlying assumption, it is that the Iranian regime is irrational and even apocalyptic, and that mere acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran, the Iranian theocratic regime, is such as it must be prevented even through preventive war. That is a huge threshold assumption. An alternative strategy is, and it's pretty much, you can sort of glean from my presentation, probably more where I'm at, is on the squeeze strategy, there have been two variants. One is through targeted sanctions, squeeze the core interest groups of the regime as a way of getting them to, if possible, change their calculus of decision. Or there are general sanctions where the idea is, we saw it in Iraq, it did not work in the 1990s, squeeze the population and this pressure will be felt by the regime and get them to change behavior. And a third variant is the really kind of pro-engagers who argue there is a deal there. We just have to argue. We just have to offer better carrots. Now, my point here is not to advocate one policy or the other, but rather to highlight that policies are based upon reads and assumptions about the character of the target state, and embedded the nuclear issue is embedded in the broader context of societal change in these countries. And the dilemma for the United States is that the timelines are not in sync. Ken Pollack at Brookings talks about 2 clocks. The proliferation issue is urgent. The societal change timeline is indeterminate. Bush tried regime change. Obama talked about as it moved toward comprehensive engagement. Maybe it's time to retool containment for Containment 2.0. At the outset of the Cold War, George Kennan wrote that the Soviet system, quote, bears within it its own seeds of decay, close quote, and argued for a strategy of, as we all know, long-term, patient, firm, and vigilant containment. A new strategy of containment whose key element would be deterrence, would decouple the nuclear issue from the question of regime change and rely on internal forces as the agent of societal change. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for this brilliant talk, Rob. Lots of issues, lots of food for thought and discussion. The floor is open for anybody. Let me, perhaps, unless Roger, you'd like to start off with a question.
Well, Rob, as a matter of fact, I did wonder about the historical context about this. Are rogue states essentially a post-Second World War phenomena, or are there examples that would fill these definitions in the 19th century? I have very hard time extending it to the 19th century.
I think, the broader issue of kind of dissatisfied states, revisionist states, is sort of like the métier of European history. I mean, the defining qualities of in the contemporary era, WMD, proliferation, and terrorism are probably novel. I would welcome kind of not as a dodge, but welcome any, because I'm not a historian by training. If any of you out there working on different countries see any resonance of the past with these current issues, but I do think that in terms of challenging norms, sort of the broad universe of conduct, their behavior, even though it doesn't relate to, translate into what was transpiring.
No, I agree with that. I just wanted to be clear about the nuclear weapons and terrorism. That's different from the historical.
I agree.
Rob has told me that he would welcome, historians poking holes into sort of historical or questioning or sharpening the historical context that
Well, let me just put it this way. This is the third in a series. I'm kind of all in on the approach, and so I can't start from scratch. But I would say that it is a work in progress, and that I'm kind of with. Is Joe Brindley, my publisher, still here? I mean, I'm working towards a kind of a third volume, which does build on the previous two, but it's not a homework assignment. You won't have to read the previous two books. Unlike I just saw the last installment of Harry Potter, where you did need to know what was going on. You can get Regime Change, volume 3, so to speak, and not have to read the prior two books. But that said, I've really given you a sense in 40 minutes. There are a lot of moving parts in my argument. And I'm drawing on new materials, particularly the work on sovereignty, norms, order, society, and would welcome comments. I see Ron Steele here, whose book Pax Americana was a big influence on me as an undergraduate getting into this field, and I know has views on issues like humanitarian intervention that he wrote about in The Imperial Temptation. So I'd welcome kind of any input, because it's in the word processor, but it's not in print, so I can make changes.
Very good. There are a number of people on my list. We'll go first to Jamil Hassanli.
Thank you. Jamil Hassanli from Azerbaijan, Baku State University, and Woodrow Wilson Scholars public policy. I want to ask two questions. One of it after crisis of socialist world and the end of the 80-year last century and the collapse Soviet Union was created very interesting situation for change world. How are United States was successful used from this situation? And the second, United States a long time was sacrificed democracy to stability. But in finally was not stability and was lost democracy. What your opinion about it? Which of role was played this policy in process continued a long time totalitarianism in several countries? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Let me answer the second first, which is, this is sort of a basic dilemma. I mean, do you deal with the regimes? I mean, the United States is one of the few countries that does not just recognize any government. I mean, if you look at, we don't have an embassy in Tehran, we don't have an embassy in Pyongyang, and this goes back, I believe, to Woodrow Wilson, who didn't recognize the Mexican government in 1912. The United States views sort of diplomatic recognition almost as sort of a form of moral endorsement. I would think we should open an embassy in Tehran. Why not? Just sort of, it would really create a huge dilemma for them of how to handle it. Although my colleague Aaron Miller said, "Are you crazy? They would just grab them and have hostages immediately." So this issue of kind of is there's that aspect of it, but also like how do you deal with regimes that are entrenched, that are not about to be overturned anytime soon? Okay, we just had regime change in the Arab Spring in Libya. And Tunisia and elsewhere. And some of them were authoritarian regimes that the United States backed during the Cold War and sort of for realpolitik reasons. And I tried to, I think that Raymond Aron's useful kind of dual identity of America as an imperial republic, which means it's a state that can will pursue its own parochial interests. But it also opens it up to hypocrisy and inconsistency. And Samuel Huntington, in his book on American politics, said, some people say the United States is a lie, and he wrote, I'm paraphrasing, it's not a lie, but it's a disappointment. But it can only be a disappointment because it's also a hope. And unlike other countries that even make human rights, other countries, I don't think it's high on the priority list in China right now, which is cultivating relations with some of the most unsavory regimes, kind of in the world. So there's this issue of how to deal with kind of regimes that are in power, where there's no immediate prospect they're going to be overturned and where outside influences are limited. After the fall of Libya, some have said, well, why don't we just do it in Syria, Yemen, and Iran? And we have had regime change precedents. I mentioned, Romania, for example. But there's also instances of the Hungarian Revolution in '56 and Tiananmen, where the regime will put the boot in, as the British would say. And today there's an article by distinguished analyst Ray Takei says the regime is crumbling in Iran. Okay, now and he's talking about fissures within the Iranian state as sort of a threshold assessment, a target state assessment. Well, what does that mean in terms of what we do? I think the case could be made, and I consume the Iranian literature. I'm not an Iran expert. Is that the Iranian regime would have no moral or political compunction of, in bald terms, killing a lot of people to maintain power. Okay? Now maybe there are some elements within the Revolutionary Guards that, and we know that historically some voted for Khatami, although there was a big purge of the military after the Khatami election. But I don't know, if you would get a Romanian type situation where parts of the regime would flip toward the Greens, or you'd end up with a Tiananmen or a Hungarian Revolution. And I think for the United States, we have to be, and I think the Obama administration has been careful in what it said, because there is a kind of a moral hazard of getting people to rise up, and we saw it with the Shia in Iraq in 1991 when the United States was not prepared to back Saddam Hussein, to move towards regime change in Iraq. Sorry for that long answer to the question. I'll try to be shorter.
That's all right. Don?
Yeah, thank you, Rob, for that.
Microphone.
You raised Syria. You mentioned Syria. I'm wondering where that fits in your category of these other states. The thing that came out for the Cheney book, where the Cheney at least was arguing for taking out the nuclear reactor, and Bush decided against it, and Israel ended up doing that. But where does that fit in with your overall categorization of these states?
Well, 3 points. First, Syria was not designated by the Clinton administration as a rogue state in the 1990s, even though Syria did have WMD programs and was a state sponsor of terrorism. And the reason was that Syria was needed for the peace process. So this, again, underscored sort of how politically selective the whole concept was and one of its weaknesses. Second, on the nuclear program in Syria, the transfer in 2007, after the North Korean nuclear detonation in October 2006, the Bush administration laid down its declaratory policy that the United States would hold accountable North Korea if it transferred capabilities to another state or non-state actor. Then in 2007, David Sanger is writing about this in his new book. He wrote about it in his old one. Someone came in, it's in the Cheney memoirs, someone came in, Mossad came in with the intelligence, hey, there's a reactor in Syria, and advocated bombing it. The North Koreans had crossed that red line, so to speak, of transfer. And this goes back to the sovereignty issue and the core cardinal principle of sovereignty. State-to-state transfer is far less objectionable than state to non-state transfer. In the United States, I think it'd be very hard for the United States to kind of set and enforce a state-to-state transfer line. It would be hard to do that. Whereas state to non-state, North Korea is on that. I think if North Korea were to sell or Iran were to transfer nuclear capabilities to a terrorist group, I think at that point the United States would seriously consider kind of a regime change kind of response. That at that point, all bets are off. The idea of of Al Qaeda getting a nuclear weapon, but it's a very it's in the nuclear posture review. It was in a couple speeches that Hadley gave, but this has been the Bush and now Obama administration trying to draw a red line, but it's hard to detect and to enforce it. The Israelis, of course, did bomb that facility, the Syrian facility. And the third point is how we've handled Syria into context of the Arab Spring. And as I mentioned to the last questioner, I think the Obama administration has been really cautious on the grounds of a regime that did Hama in 1981, I guess it was. When was Hama? Late 70s. It has a record of brutal crackdowns. It's killed already 2,600 people in the current crackdown. So you don't want to be in a position of promoting an uprising which you're not prepared to back. But at the same time, the administration has been clear in talking about the lack of legitimacy of the Assad government. So I think it's really threading a diplomatic needle, and I give them high marks for how they've handled it. Not that they're looking for anyone's marks.
Rob, I want to follow up on the question of Libya, and in the aftermath of Libya, just how attractive is this engage the outlier model? Because indeed, Libya did engage, it did agree to disband its weapons of mass destruction, and 8 years later, we weren't that concerned evidently about Libya's sovereignty, and the assurances that we gave kind of disappeared rather quickly. So from your perspective, has the U.S. discredited that policy, and how viable is it going forward?
Only in a seminar room of the Wilson Center could one make the analytical distinction that we did not intervene on non-proliferation grounds in Libya in 2003, but we did intervene on humanitarian intervention grounds in 2011. I think we have priced ourselves out of the reassurance market with North Korea and Iran. But I do hold out some hope, the possibility of diplomatic engagement in these terms, which is the primary optic will be containment and deterrence. But, as Kennan was open to it, there should be pragmatic negotiations with adversaries if it's in our interest. For example, at the end of the Clinton administration, at the end of the Clinton administration, they left on the table a deal that Clinton, who told Lee Hamilton this, thought that Bush would take up quickly in 2001, which was essentially a buyout of the North Korean ballistic missile program. There have been proposals that would bound the scope of the North Korean and the Iranian programs. Rollback is no longer an option with these countries. North Korea has detonated 2 nuclear weapons, and they are gaining access to fissile material now through a uranium enrichment route as well as through plutonium separation. But if we could bound the scope of the problem, for example, if the type of deal that was discussed with the Iranians about taking some LEU, low-enriched uranium, out of the country so that it could not be kind of enriched to weapons grade, or circumscribing the North Korean program in some respect. I think that's the type of negotiation that the United States pragmatically should be prepared to engage in, and even put in some money. Now, it's not Dame Geld or appeasement. It's really a way of trying to buy time and bound the program until kind of the internal processes can play out. And that's indeterminate. But politically, that's problematic to pitch. I mean, it's really hard because it's viewed as kind of appeasing bad guys. So essentially,
yep. Wait for the microphone.
In your research for this third book, have you taken up the issue of national sovereignty and terrorists within a nation, and technology, and the drive towards using that military technology preemptively?
Our use of
correct.
In one of my chapters, I deal with the issue of states and terrorism, and basically you've got 3 categories. You've got state sponsors of terrorism, passive sponsors of terrorism that turn a blind eye. Pakistan, India, and Saudi Arabia would be examples, and then states with weak capacity that can't assert a sovereignty over their own territory, and the terrorists can operate on it. There is some good news. State sponsorship of terrorism is a declining phenomenon. Post 9/11 and the international system really has isolated state sponsors of terrorism. We have this list, which was a unilateral American list, in which you can tell from my presentation I'm not a fan of unilateral American lists, but the states that were on that list did want to get off that list. And it's actually been a problem to get them off the list, and that underscores sort of one of the problems with them. Cuba's on the list. It should not be on the list. But because of the whole political optic, no one wants to take them off the list because that would be viewed as a political signal to Cuba, leading a former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism to say, go get your own sanctions. Don't have to clutter up mine by listing Cuba as a state-sponsored terrorism. But the argument of the book, and it's a Westphalian state-centric book, but it is essentially, if you get it right on the state level, you don't eliminate the non-state problem, but you go far in addressing it. That if you can get state sponsors to get out of the business, if you can get passive sponsors to no longer turn a blind eye, and if you can get states with weak capacity, the Somalias and the Nigers, to develop capacity to control their own territory, and that's extremely difficult because it's tied in with state building, you go a long way in addressing the problem. You don't end it. So the state-based strategies are the prerequisite for effective strategies to deal with non-state threats. And as we've seen, look at the speech that John Brennan gave up at Harvard on the question of sovereignty, and this perverse situation where we got into Afghanistan because we were worried about Pakistan, and now we're staying in Afghanistan because we want a predator base to hit Pakistan. So all the questions about the legality of predator strikes, in terms of the legality of the killings and strikes on sovereign territory of another state. And I'd refer you to the speech of John Brennan at Harvard Law School for a spirited defense of the Obama administration's policy. But they will continue to do it. I mean, I think the Obama administration, which has been, you read the A section of the paper over cornflakes and you see how much criticism they get. I'm amazed by how really almost Michael Corleone-ish, the administration has been in going after adversaries. In the Northwest Frontier Province, the extraordinarily daring takedown of bin Laden May 1st. Really kind of impressive. Controversial because of sovereignty issues and the like, but really, I think, effective.
Thank you. Let me perhaps jump in with one or two questions my own. One, Rob, when you talk about outliers and outlaws, you differentiated between revisionist states and revolutionary states, and argued that China really doesn't fit the category of a revolutionary state anymore.
Mm.
That was in the Cold War, perhaps no longer. And you cited the 2025 review, and so there is a long-term perspective there in a way. But of course, to what extent does China approach changes in the international system, revolutionary or not, on a much longer timeline than we have in the past? And Nazi Germany, it was within a few years, and didn't happen. I'm not a China specialist, but my sense is that the time frame is much longer. And to what extent would that change the optic of your argument, which in the end though is of course one that looks that it's targeted at a policy audience that has to make decisions within hours, days, weeks, months. So
we had a conference last summer or actually it was a year ago, with Harvard Kennedy School and Chinese institutions on sort of this $1 trillion question, $64 trillion question of China in the 21st century, and whether it could be accommodated in the system, stakeholder, or would challenge the system. And books such as John Mearsheimer's, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which argues from a structural realist perspective that there will be inevitable conflict with China, or John Eikenberry's newest book, Liberal Leviathan, that argues that, in a sense, the rise of China is testimony to the success of the liberal international order and that it can be accommodated within it. That the conflict, we could bumble our way into it, but it's not preordained by structure. I guess I'm more on the, I don't believe in sort of the structural determinist argument, and I think there's a worrisome development in Chinese political culture and the kind of using, at a time when the legitimacy of the Communist Party has been kind of really undermined and is no longer kind of an effective source of legitimacy, that nationalism is being kind of revived. And I think that has been used as sort of an instrument for mobilization, and I think that's a worrisome trend. The Chinese have, in terms of there's a literature on Chinese compliance with international norms. It's better than it's been in terms of the norms that the United States worries about. The original sin on proliferation from the U.S. perspective was the Chinese provision to Pakistan, and then A.Q. Khan basically photocopied the package, and it went out from there, complete with documents in Libya with Chinese characters on them. But they've gotten they've improved on that, but compliance is could be better. For example, in Libya, the Chinese supported the UN Security Council resolution. Yet, as we now know from captured documents in Tripoli, I don't know if Jim Hirschberg or someone else has been, planning to go there to kind of try to access those documents. We know that Chinese commercial entities were engaged. The PLA, arms companies were dealing with the Gaddafi regime to sell them small arms in the lead up to the crackdown. So I think we've got a compliance problem, but it's better. It's at least better, than it was, and I think that holding them to account is one way of doing so, and pointing to their own self-interest. Do they really want North Korea to be a nuclear weapon state? North Korea is on their border. Iran is closer to them than to us. To tap their national interest in dealing with these problems. Going back to an original question about the U.S. role, the United States is associated with providing global public goods. Fareed Zakaria has written a lot about this. And questions about, in time of military austerity, what happens to these global public goods and whether the cost should be shared. I think that's a bit of what this leading from behind rubric was about, to get others to do more. And the Libya intervention in 2011 really is in stark contrast with Iraq in 2003. $1 billion price tag instead of $1 trillion price tag, no casualties, and not left with having to provide boots on the ground to reconstitute Libyan political culture. So that's sort of a long way around to the China question. But
I'll call on Sam, but just my second quick question was, you said rogue state was basically a unilateral American concept. Now your next book will be on outliers and outlaws. To what extent have other countries come up with similar terms, if at all? And how does outliers and outlaws, or any of these terms, how would they translate?
Probably most countries would be more comfortable with states of concern or something like that. Outlier was a term used by the Obama administration. There's a brilliant book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers, and I wasn't going to call mine, as someone suggested, The Outliers. I added outlaw state because I think that there are states that are, compliance with international norms, occurs along a continuum, and you could look at like the most kind of norm-compliant state around, take a thought experiment like Norway or some state that's highly compliant in terms of how it behaves in the world and how it treats its own people. And then you can come at the upper end of the spectrum, and you're talking about like North Korea, Zimbabwe, the worst of the worst, as the book by Rothberg is titled at Harvard. I think we know who those states are, and to me, that would be a kind of appropriate kind of, as a shorthand. States that egregiously violate international norms. Now, can they provide? Is there to continue to extend the law, the metaphor coming out of the penal system? Can the outlaws be reformed or not? And I think without a regime change, or does the bad behavior really derive from their character? Can you have a regime change from within? And I think the Gorbachev case. I mean, you think of the arc of Soviet history, from Stalin to Gorbachev, in my lifetime. I mean, that's extraordinary, and.
So Burma doesn't qualify because Burma is a menace only to itself?
Well, it would qualify. I have not looked at the human rights pariah. I thought about a chapter on the human rights pariahs, and one of our fellows, thanks to our fellows who are here, we have interaction with, because the serendipity of that can have great consequences. I had lunch with one of our fellows, and I thought, I'm going to do a chapter on human rights pariahs. And he said, don't do a chapter on human rights pariahs, because it's not what I've worked on, so it would be a new topic to me. And he says, once you get into compliance with human rights, you'll invariably get, why is Burma in but Saudi Arabia is not in? And you get into all these definitional issues. So the focus of my book is really on the states that violate external behavioral norms, and I've described how that's sort of contested turf itself. But those regimes that create problems beyond their borders treat their people abysmally within their borders. And the dilemma I've looked at, rather than the broad subgroup of human rights violators, is how can we deal with the external behavior, turn that off, without giving, say, North Korea a pass on how it treats its own people.
Sam?
Thanks. Rob, I want to go back to the question Pat Harahan raised about technologies and preferred methods of strategy. It seems to me that the administration is facing a huge problem, and any follow-on administration will face the same problem, in that we've got three particularly effective instruments that are currently advantageous. One is drones. The second is the use of highly trained special forces and our ability to get them into very difficult locales. And the third is cyber attacks. All of these are well outside the norms you're talking about, and some parts of our government, mainly the international lawyers and the State Department, are concerned with the norms. The Defense Department and Homeland Security and CIA are concerned with results, and they've got three or more categories of new instruments that lead to essentially entering a brave new world. And how do you see any of that playing out?
Well, thanks, Sam. I acknowledge Ron Steele's influential book. I should also acknowledge Sam Wells, my mentor, who hired me to work at the Wilson Center an age ago. I think you just defined what sort of is the new threshold, new frontier in terms of subject matter. And I think those elements actually, I know the Obama administration has shied away, I think with good reason, from the proclaiming a doctrine. But I think there is a strategy in an age of fiscally constrained defense budgets and where there's no appetite for overseas interventions, and yet there are kind of real threats out there. And the drones, the stuck nets, which began during the Bush administration, but which continued and implemented under the Obama administration, and probably with all the kind of gaseous kind of criticism of Obama out in the blogosphere and on cable news, did more than anything to sort of set back the Iranian nuclear program. Use of kind of special forces like at Abbottabad. I think those, if you kind of connect those dots, that's basically the U.S. and you add to that global strike, okay, which is in kind of high gear of development to allow kind of long-range conventional strikes anywhere on the globe, within an hour. And you see kind of, I think, the elements of what one could call an Obama strategy.
Good. We're just about at the end of the time, unless there is anybody who can't live with himself without asking a question. With permission of my co-chair, I'd like to call this session to end, but not without thanking and asking you to give a round of applause to Rob Litwack. Thank you. Thanks, Rob.